The welts had scabbed over on Bessie Coleman's back, but the humiliation burned fresh as morning coffee. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the cabin she'd built with her own hands, staring at the deed that had cost her 40 lashes and nearly her life. The paper trembled in her fingers, not from fear but from rage that threatened to consume what little strength she had left. 40 acres, she whispered to the empty room, her voice hoarse from screaming. 40 acres that I bought with money I earned scrubbing floors and taking in washing for 5 years. Outside her window, the Mississippi sun beat down on the cotton fields that stretched toward the horizon. It was 1923, and the world had supposedly changed since slavery ended, but Bessie knew better. She'd learned the hard way that a black woman owning land was still an offense punishable by public whipping in Millbrook County. The door creaked open without a knock, and Bessie's hand instinctively moved toward the shotgun beside her bed. But it was only Clara Washington, her closest neighbor, and the only other black landowner in 20 miles. "Lord have mercy," Clara breathed, taking in the torn dress draped over the chair and the raw wounds that showed through the gaps in Bessie's camise. "I heard what they did. But seeing it—" She shook her head, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Don't you start crying over me," Bessie said, though her voice lacked its usual strength. "Tears won't heal my back or get those white folks to accept that this land is mine." Clara pulled up the rickety wooden chair and sat down heavily. At 63, she'd seen enough horror to fill several lifetimes, but the systematic brutality of what had happened to Bessie shook her to the core. "Tell me what happened," Clara said quietly. "All of it." Bessie's jaw tightened. She'd been over it 100 times in her mind, but speaking it aloud would make it real in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I went to register the deed at the courthouse," she began, her fingers still gripping the paper. "Just like any other property owner. I had all the documents, all the receipts showing I'd paid every cent fair and square." The memory played out in vivid detail, walking up those courthouse steps in her best dress, the one she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd saved for months to buy. She'd held her head high, knowing she belonged there as much as any white man with property to register. "Clerk looked at me like I was something he'd scrape off his shoe," Bessie continued. "Asked me whose land I was trying to register. When I told him it was mine, he laughed. Actually laughed, Clara. Said, 'Nigger women don't own land in Mississippi.'" Clara's hands clenched into fists, but she remained silent, letting Bessie purge the poison of the day's events. "I showed him the deed, the bank receipts, everything. He called Sheriff Morrison over, and before I knew it, they were dragging me outside. Said I was trying to perpetrate fraud, claimed I must have stolen the papers." The courthouse square had filled quickly once word spread that a black woman was causing trouble. Bessie remembered the faces, some curious, some angry, all united in their certainty that she had no right to stand where she stood. "They tied me to that old whipping post right there in front of God and everybody." Bessie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Morrison himself held the whip, said they were going to teach me what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place." Clara reached out and gently took Bessie's hand, careful not to jostle her injured shoulder. "Each lash, they asked me whose land it really was. Each time I told them it was mine. By the 20th lash, I was barely conscious, but I kept saying it. It's my land. I paid for it. It's mine." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of injustice and the sound of Bessie's ragged breathing. "The worst part," Bessie said finally, "wasn't the pain. It was watching all those people cheer, watching children learn that this is what happens when someone like me dares to dream beyond what they think I deserve." Clara squeezed her hand tighter. "But you didn't give up the deed." "No," Bessie said, a spark of defiance flickering in her eyes. "Even when they threw me in the dirt and told me to burn it, I held on. This land is mine, Clara. I'd rather die than give it up." "And what about now? What are you going to do?" Bessie looked out the window at the 40 acres that had cost her so much blood. The cotton was coming in well, and the small vegetable garden she'd planted was thriving. This wasn't just land. It was proof that she could build something lasting, something that belonged to her and no one else. "I'm going to farm it," she said simply. "I'm going to live on it, work it, and defend it. And if they come for me again, they better come ready for a fight." Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees that bordered her property, casting long shadows across the fields. Somewhere in those shadows, Bessie knew, men were already planning their next move. But for the first time since the whipping, she felt something other than pain. She felt resolve. 3 days after the whipping, Bessie woke to the sound of hammering. She struggled to sit up, her back still screaming with pain, and peered through the window. What she saw made no sense. Thomas McCready, the white farmer whose property bordered hers to the north, was driving fence posts into the ground along her property line. His sleeves were rolled up, sweat already darkening his shirt despite the early hour, and he worked with the methodical precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Bessie grabbed her wrapper and stepped outside, moving carefully to avoid pulling at her healing wounds. McCready looked up as she approached, his weathered face unreadable. "Morning, Miss Coleman," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a politeness that surprised her. In the 3 months she'd owned the land, they had exchanged maybe a dozen words, and those only about straying livestock. "Mr. McCready," she replied warily, "what are you doing on my property line?" He straightened up, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Building a fence. Should have done it years ago, really. Good fences make good neighbors, as they say." Bessie studied his face, looking for signs of mockery or threat. Thomas McCready was known throughout the county as a fair man, but a practical one. He'd never shown her any particular kindness, but he'd never shown her cruelty either. He simply treated her like another farmer, which in itself was unusual enough to make her suspicious. "Why now?" she asked bluntly. McCready was quiet for a long moment, measuring his words carefully. "I heard what happened at the courthouse. Heard about—" He gestured vaguely toward her back. "That was wrong. Deed or no deed, that was wrong. Wrong enough to risk helping a black woman?" The question hung between them like a challenge. McCready set down his hammer and looked her straight in the eye. "My daddy fought in the Civil War," he said finally. "Not for the glory or the politics, but because his brother was killed at Antietam. Before he died, my uncle wrote him a letter, said he wasn't fighting to free slaves or preserve the Union. He was fighting because he couldn't stand living in a world where a man's worth was measured by the color of his skin instead of the content of his character." Bessie felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But hope was dangerous for someone in her position. "Pretty words," she said carefully. "But this isn't a war anymore. This is Mississippi in 1923, and I'm a black woman who dared to buy land. Your fence won't change that." "No," McCready agreed. "But it might make folks think twice about what they're willing to do in broad daylight. Hard to claim someone's trespassing when there's a clear property line. Hard to claim they don't belong when there's a fence saying they do." He picked up his hammer again and drove another post into the hard-packed earth. "Besides, I've got my own reasons for wanting clear boundaries. Some folks around here think they can take what they want from whoever they want. About time somebody stood up and said different." Bessie watched him work, trying to understand his motivation. In her experience, white men didn't risk their standing in the community for principle alone. There had to be something else. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. McCready paused, considering whether to answer. "You ever wonder why this land was for sale in the first place? Why old Henderson was so eager to sell to the first person with cash money?" Bessie had wondered, actually. The land was good. Fertile soil, adequate water, well-positioned for getting crops to market. It should have been snapped up by one of the established white farmers in the area. "Henderson owed money to some influential people in town," McCready continued. "Sheriff Morrison's brother-in-law, Judge Carter, a few others. They wanted this land as payment, but Henderson knew they'd cheat him out of what it was worth. So when you came along with cash and a willingness to pay fair price, he jumped at it. The picture was becoming clearer. So now they're angry they can't get the land cheap." "Exactly, and they figure if they can drive you off through intimidation, they can buy it from the county for taxes or claim it was abandoned. Either way, they get what they wanted for a fraction of what you paid." Bessie felt her anger flare. "So this fence, it's not really about helping me. It's about stopping them from getting what they want." McCready looked up from his work, and for the first time, she saw something like anger in his eyes. Maybe it started that way. But after what I saw at the courthouse— He shook his head. "What they did to you wasn't about land or money. It was about keeping people like you in what they consider your place. And I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by and watch it happen." Even if it costs you? Even if it costs me, he said firmly. Some things are worth the cost. As if summoned by their conversation, a cloud of dust appeared on the road leading to Bessie's property. 3 riders approached at a leisurely pace, and Bessie recognized Sheriff Morrison's bulky figure even at a distance. "Looks like we're about to find out just how much it's going to cost," she said quietly. McCready drove another fence post into the ground with particular force. "Let them come. This is your land, Miss Coleman, and now everybody's going to know exactly where the boundaries are." The riders drew closer, and Bessie could see the cold calculation in their eyes. They'd come to finish what they started at the courthouse, but now they'd have to contend with more than just one isolated black woman. They'd have to contend with a fence that said she belonged exactly where she was. Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the half-completed fence line and the 2 figures standing beside it. His companions, Deputy Webb and Clayton Carter, the judge's nephew, flanked him on either side, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. "Well, well," Morrison drawled, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man accustomed to immediate compliance. "Tom McCready building fences for niggers now. That's a new one." McCready didn't stop working. He positioned another fence post and began driving it into the ground with measured strokes. "Building fences on my property line, Jake, same as any landowner has a right to do." "Your property line?" Deputy Webb laughed, a harsh sound that made Bessie's skin crawl. "Last I checked, this here's stolen property. That deed she's waving around ain't worth the paper it's printed on." Bessie stepped forward, the movement sending fire through her healing back. "That deed is legal and recorded. I paid every cent owed, and I have the receipts to prove it." Morrison's hand moved to the bullwhip coiled at his belt. "You didn't learn your lesson the first time, girl? Thought 40 lashes might have knocked some sense into that thick skull of yours." "The only thing 40 lashes taught me," Bessie said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat, "is that some people will go to any length to steal what doesn't belong to them." Clayton Carter stepped closer, his young face twisted with entitlement and rage. "You calling us thieves, nigger?" "I'm calling you exactly what you are," Bessie replied. "Men who think they can take by force what they couldn't get by honest means." The tension ratcheted higher, and Bessie could feel violence gathering like storm clouds. But McCready's hammer continued its steady rhythm, each blow driving the fence post deeper into the earth. "Tom," Morrison said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "you need to step away from this. Whatever fool notion you've got about helping this woman, it ain't worth what it's going to cost you." McCready finally looked up, his face grim but determined. "And what exactly is it going to cost me, Jake?" "Your standing in the community, for starters, your customers, your credit at the bank, your welcome at the church. You think folks around here are going to do business with a nigger lover?" "I think," McCready said carefully, "that most folks around here are decent people who believe in property rights and fair dealing. And I think they're getting tired of watching a few bullies run roughshod over the law whenever it suits them." Deputy Webb spat in the dirt. "Property rights? That woman ain't got no right to own property. This is white man's country, and it's going to stay that way." "According to who?" McCready asked. "The Constitution says otherwise. The law says otherwise. Even the Bible says otherwise. God shows no partiality between persons." Morrison's face darkened. "Don't quote scripture at me, Tom. I know what the good book says about keeping to your own kind." "I know what it says about justice and mercy, too," McCready replied, "and about protecting the widow and the fatherless. Last I checked, Miss Coleman qualifies on both counts." Bessie watched the exchange with growing amazement. She'd never seen a white man stand up to the sheriff like this, never seen one risk his position in the community to defend her rights. It was almost more shocking than the whipping had been. Clayton Carter drew his pistol, the metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Maybe we need to remind both of you what happens to people who don't know their place." But McCready didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded document. "You might want to look at this before you do something you'll regret, Clayton." Carter snatched the paper and unfolded it, his face growing pale as he read. "What the hell is this?" "That," McCready said calmly, "is a copy of a letter I sent to the governor's office this morning. Details everything that happened at the courthouse 3 days ago, including the illegal whipping of a property owner who was trying to register a legitimate deed. Also mentioned some interesting irregularities in local land transactions that might interest the state attorney general. Morrison lunged forward and grabbed the letter from Carter's hands. As he read, his face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. "You son of a bitch," he breathed. "You think you can threaten us?" "I'm not threatening anyone," McCready said mildly. "I'm just ensuring that if anything happens to Miss Coleman or her property, there's going to be a full investigation by people who don't have a financial stake in the outcome." Bessie felt a surge of admiration for the white farmers' tactical thinking. He'd turned their own corruption against them, making it too risky for them to continue their intimidation campaign. But she also knew that desperate men do desperate things. "This ain't over," Morrison said, shoving the letter back at McCready. "Not by a long shot. You think hiding behind the governor's skirts is going to protect you forever?" "I think," McCready said, driving another fence post into the ground, "that all I need to do is outlast you. And I've got time, patience, and the law on my side. How about you?" The three men remounted their horses, but Morrison turned back for one final threat. "You're making a mistake, Tom. Both of you. This country ain't ready for what you're trying to do, and it's going to crush you for trying." "Maybe," McCready agreed. "But maybe it's time this country grew up a little. Maybe it's time we started living up to the principles we claim to believe in." As the riders departed, Bessie watched them go with mixed emotions. She was grateful for McCready's support, but she also knew that his intervention had escalated the conflict beyond anything she could have imagined. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. McCready positioned another fence post. "Yes, I did. Some things are worth fighting for, Miss Coleman, and your right to own this land is one of them." The fence stretched between them and the road now, a physical barrier that declared to the world that this land belonged to Bessie Coleman. But both of them knew that the real battle was just beginning. The first sign of organized resistance came on Sunday morning. Thomas McCready arrived at Millbrook Baptist Church to find his usual pew occupied by the Henderson family, who normally sat 3 rows back. When he approached, Jacob Henderson looked up with barely concealed hostility. "Pew's taken, Tom. Maybe you'd be more comfortable worshiping elsewhere." McCready surveyed the sanctuary and realized that every available seat had been strategically filled. Men who normally nodded respectfully to him now avoided his gaze. Women who had once greeted him warmly turned their backs as he passed. "I see," McCready said quietly, "and I suppose this sudden lack of space has nothing to do with the fence I've been building." Henderson's wife, Martha, sniffed disdainfully. "It has to do with you forgetting your place in this community, Thomas McCready. We don't take kindly to race traitors here." The words hit like a physical blow, but McCready kept his expression neutral. He'd expected social consequences for his actions, but the speed and coordination of the response surprised him. Reverend Phillips approached from the pulpit, his face grave with concern. "Tom, perhaps we should speak privately after the service." "Perhaps we should speak now," McCready replied, his voice carrying far enough for most of the congregation to hear. "If my presence here is causing such distress, I'd like to understand why." Phillips glanced nervously at the filled pews, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "Tom, you know I've always respected you as a member of this congregation, but your recent associations have caused concern among the faithful." "My associations?" McCready's voice remained level, but Bessie, watching from the window of her cabin a mile away, would have recognized the edge of anger creeping in. "Are you referring to my decision to fence my property line and support my neighbor's legal right to her land?" "You know it's more complicated than that," Phillips said. "This community has certain traditions, certain ways of maintaining harmony. When those traditions are challenged, it creates division among the faithful." An older woman in the back pew stood up, her voice shaking with indignation. "That nigger woman is an affront to decent Christian society. The Bible is clear about the natural order of things, and you're helping her upset that order." McCready turned to face her, his patience finally wearing thin. "Mrs. Carmichael, perhaps you could point me to the verse that says land ownership should be determined by skin color. Because I've read my Bible pretty thoroughly, and I must have missed that particular commandment." "Don't you take that tone with me, young man. I've been reading scripture since before you were born." "Then you'll remember," McCready said, his voice growing stronger, "that Jesus said the greatest commandments were to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't add any qualifiers about the color of your neighbor's skin." Reverend Phillips raised his hands, trying to restore order. Gentlemen, ladies, this is the house of God. Surely we can discuss these matters with Christian charity, and there's nothing Christian about what happened at that courthouse. McCready interrupted. A woman was publicly whipped for the crime of owning property legally purchased with her own money. If that doesn't outrage your Christian sensibilities, then maybe you need to examine what kind of Christianity you're really practicing. The sanctuary erupted in angry voices, with some supporting McCready's position and others condemning it. Through the chaos, Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed from the back of the church. Seems like Tom McCready's got more interest in preaching than farming these days. Maybe he should find himself a congregation that appreciates his particular brand of theology. McCready turned to face Morrison, who had positioned himself strategically near the door. And maybe you should remember that your job is enforcing the law, not making it. Last I checked, property ownership was still legal in Mississippi, regardless of the owner's race. Legal's a relative term, Morrison replied with a cold smile. Depends on how you interpret the law, and around here, we interpret it in ways that maintain order and respect for tradition. Whose tradition? McCready demanded. The tradition of justice? The tradition of equal treatment under law? Or just the tradition of keeping people in the place you think they belong? The confrontation might have escalated further, but Deputy Webb burst through the church doors with news that changed everything. "Sheriff," he called out, breathless from running. "There's trouble at the Coleman place. Someone set fire to her cotton field during the night. Whole north section's gone." A collective gasp went up from the congregation, followed by murmurs that McCready couldn't quite make out. He pushed past Morrison and headed for the door, but the sheriff's hand on his arm stopped him. "Where you think you're going, Tom?" "To help my neighbor deal with the fire damage," McCready replied, shaking off Morrison's grip. "Might want to be careful about that," Morrison said with false concern. "Folks might start thinking you had something to do with it. After all, you're the one who's been so interested in her property lately." McCready stared at the sheriff in disbelief. "Are you seriously suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything," Morrison said innocently. "Just pointing out that arson's a serious crime, and we need to consider all possibilities. Wouldn't want the wrong person to get blamed." The threat was clear, and McCready realized with growing alarm how skillfully his opponents were maneuvering. They'd isolated him from his community, questioned his motives, and now they were positioning themselves to frame him for the very crimes they were committing. But as he looked around the sanctuary at the faces of people he'd known his entire life, he saw something that gave him hope. Not everyone was buying into the fear and hatred. Some faces showed uncertainty, others showed quiet support, and a few showed outright disgust at what they were witnessing. "Reverend Phillips," McCready said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "I came here today to worship God and fellowship with my neighbors. Instead, I've learned that some of you believe Christian charity only extends to people who look like you and agree with you. That's not the Christianity I was raised with, and it's not the Christianity I'm going to practice." He walked toward the door, pausing only to address the congregation one final time. "Miss Coleman's cotton field is burning while we stand here arguing about whether she deserves our help. I'm going to do what any decent neighbor would do. I'm going to help her save what can be saved and rebuild what can't. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome. Anyone who doesn't, well, you'll have to live with that choice." As McCready strode out of the church, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw 4 men and 2 women following. Not many, but enough to remind him that he wasn't entirely alone. The battle for Bessie Coleman's land had become a battle for the soul of the community itself. The dust clouds appeared on the horizon just as McCready and Bessie finished creating fire breaks around her remaining cotton fields. 3 cars moved with deliberate purpose down the dirt road, their occupants clearly not coming to offer assistance with the fire damage. Sheriff Morrison climbed out of the lead vehicle with obvious satisfaction, followed by Deputy Webb and several of the county's most influential men. But it was the tall, well-dressed stranger who emerged from the second car that made McCready's stomach tighten with apprehension. State Attorney Harrison Wells had a reputation throughout Mississippi for legal maneuvering that could destroy lives with the stroke of a pen. "Thomas McCready," Wells announced in a voice accustomed to commanding courtrooms, "you're under arrest for arson, conspiracy, and destruction of property. Miss Coleman, you're charged as an accessory and with filing fraudulent land claims." McCready stepped protectively closer to Bessie, his mind racing through the implications. On whose authority? "We were in church when this fire started. with dozens of witnesses who can verify our whereabouts. Wells produced official-looking documents from his jacket with theatrical flourish. On the authority of the state of Mississippi, based on credible witness testimony, it seems several citizens observed you and Miss Coleman near this field yesterday evening, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument about insurance claims and property values. The setup was masterful in its simplicity. McCready realized with growing dread they had created a narrative that painted him and Bessie as conspirators who had staged the fire for financial gain, or to generate sympathy for their cause. With the right judge and carefully selected jury, such charges might actually succeed in this political climate. But as Wells approached with handcuffs gleaming in the afternoon sun, Elizabeth Garrett stepped deliberately between them, her small camera held steady in her weathered hands. "I wouldn't proceed with that course of action if I were you, Mr. Wells," she said with remarkable calm for someone facing down the full power of the state legal system. Wells paused, clearly irritated by this unexpected interference. "Ma'am, you need to step aside immediately. This is official state business, and interfering with arrests constitutes a serious felony." Elizabeth smiled sweetly and raised her camera, clicking another photograph that captured Wells with his handcuffs extended toward unarmed citizens. "And this, Mr. Wells, is journalism. I've been systematically documenting everything that has transpired here today, including your rather dramatic arrival and these remarkable accusations. I wonder how such photographs might appear on the front pages of newspapers in Jackson, Memphis, and perhaps even as far away as New York." The threat implicit in her words was clear, and McCready watched Wells recalculate his position as more witnesses stepped forward from where they had been working to contain the fire damage. "What evidence?" Samuel Henderson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 generations of respected farming in this county. "Because I was here at dawn helping to fight this fire, and I can provide detailed testimony about exactly how it started and who was responsible." Wells turned toward him with barely concealed frustration. "And your qualifications for such expert testimony would be what, exactly?" "Samuel Henderson. My family has been farming this county since before you were born, Mr. Wells. I know arson when I see it, and I certainly know the difference between a natural grass fire and one deliberately started with accelerant." He gestured toward the unnaturally straight burn line that cut across Bessie's property. "This fire was set intentionally with kerosene or similar petroleum products, but not by Miss Coleman or Mr. McCready. They were desperately trying to stop its spread toward her buildings." "That's remarkably convenient testimony," Deputy Webb sneered from his position near the cars. "How can we possibly verify that you're not simply another part of this conspiracy?" Elizabeth raised her camera again, the clicking sound somehow ominous in the tense silence. "Because unlike certain people in positions of authority, Samuel Henderson has built his reputation on decades of honest dealing and truthful testimony. Now, Mr. Wells, are you planning to arrest half the county? Because I count 6 credible witnesses here who can testify that your accusations are completely fabricated." Wells hesitated for the first time since his arrival, clearly recognizing that the situation had evolved far beyond his original expectations. The arrest warrants he carried were based on hastily fabricated witness statements and purely circumstantial evidence that would never withstand scrutiny in court, especially with multiple credible witnesses prepared to contradict every detail of his narrative. But just as the standoff threatened to escalate into something more dangerous, another cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. This time, however, the approaching vehicle was distinctly different from the local cars. A large black sedan with official government license plates, moving with unmistakable federal authority. Wells's confident expression transformed into something approaching panic as the sedan pulled up alongside the other vehicles. The man who emerged was tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to wielding significant power without question. "Mr. Wells," the newcomer said in a voice that carried the crisp authority of federal law enforcement, "I am Assistant Attorney General Morrison. No family relation to your local sheriff here. I believe you have been expecting my arrival, though perhaps not quite so soon." Wells fumbled for appropriate words, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Sir, I wasn't specifically aware that federal oversight was involved in this particular matter." "Of course you weren't," Morrison interrupted with cold precision. "That was rather the entire point of this unannounced investigation. The governor's office received some extremely disturbing reports about systematic civil rights violations occurring in this county. Apparently, Law-abiding citizens are being subjected to public physical punishment for the supposed crime of exercising their constitutionally protected property ownership rights. The federal government has taken very serious notice of these developments. McCready felt a surge of hope flood through him as he realized his carefully worded letter to the governor had apparently reached exactly the right hands and prompted immediate federal intervention. "Now then," Assistant Attorney General Morrison continued, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had investigated similar situations throughout the South, "perhaps someone can provide me with a reasonable explanation for why a state attorney is threatening to arrest law-abiding citizens for the supposed crime of fighting fires on their own legally owned property." The confrontation that followed was surprisingly swift and decisive. Faced with direct federal oversight, photographic evidence of their actions, and multiple credible witnesses prepared to testify about the truth of recent events, Wells and Sheriff Morrison found themselves with no viable options except complete retreat. The fabricated charges were quietly withdrawn, and within 1 week both men would find themselves reassigned to significantly less visible positions in distant parts of the state. The real victory, however, came 6 months later, when Bessie Coleman's new cotton crop yielded the highest harvest per acre in the county's recorded history. Thomas McCready's farming partnership with her proved so remarkably successful that 3 other established white farmers quietly approached them about similar collaborative arrangements. Elizabeth Garrett's photographs would eventually help launch a comprehensive federal investigation into civil rights violations throughout Mississippi that would ultimately reach the Supreme Court. As the official vehicles departed that smoky afternoon, leaving behind the small group of allies standing beside the burned ruins of one dream and the solid foundation of another, they committed themselves to the patient, difficult work of making real change happen through daily choices, individual courage, and unwavering determination. The fence that McCready had built still stood firm along the property line, its posts driven deep into Mississippi soil that had witnessed both terrible injustice and remarkable redemption. It had evolved into something far more significant than a simple boundary marker. It had become a powerful declaration that certain lines, once drawn in the sacred name of justice and human dignity, cannot be crossed by hatred, fear, or the corrupt exercise of illegitimate power. And on the far side of that fence, Bessie Coleman's 40 acres stretched toward the endless horizon, protected not merely by legal documents and government authority, but by the unshakable determination of ordinary people who chose to believe that right would ultimately prove more powerful than might, that justice would eventually triumph over oppression, and that courage could indeed change the world, 1 acre at a time.